Pull that stool closer to the fire, would you? That's it. Don't mind the draft under the door. This building stood here long enough that the winds learned to find every crack and crevice. There, better. You'll have come in from the cold, I expect. Felt that wind cutting across the moor. Nasty piece of work tonight, that one. The sort that makes you grateful for stone walls and a decent blaze. Here, let me top up your glass. This porter's been in conditioning since autumn, and it'll put the warmth back in your bones. Nights like this, folk have always sought shelter, always will. It's the sensible thing, the human thing. When darkness falls and the temperature drops and you're miles from anywhere, you look for a light in the window, a door that might open, a hearth with room for one more. The thing is though, and this is the part that keeps me thoughtful on wild nights, sometimes the person knocking isn't looking for shelter at all. Sometimes they're looking for opportunity, and sometimes the tool they carry to exploit that opportunity is so specific, so peculiar in its function, and so terrible in its making, that it crosses the line from criminality into something darker. I'm talking about a candle. Just a candle, you might think. Except the candlestick wasn't brass or pewter or wood. It was a hand, a human hand severed at the wrist, withered to leather, and prepared according to recipes that sound more like recipes for damnation than anything you'd find in an honest household. They called it the Hand of Glory. Now, before you wave that away as Gothic fancy, something dreamed up by writers with too much imagination and too little to do, let me tell you that we have the recipes, written down in books, grimoires they called them, printed and circulated among people who genuinely believed this thing would work. The instructions are sickeningly precise, the ingredients are specific, and the purpose was always the same: to induce a charmed sleep so deep that a house could be stripped bare while the inhabitants lay helpless, locked in their own beds by something that burned with a coal blue flame. There's a particular storm that features in the most famous telling of this story. Not just any gale, but the Helm Wind. You won't have heard of it unless you know the Pennines. It's the only named wind in Britain, and it screams down off Crossfell like a freight train. When the helm is blowing, the cloud sits on the ridge like a bar of iron, and the wind beneath it tears at anything standing upright. Sheep huddle in the lee of walls, trees bend parallel to the ground, and anyone caught on Stainmore when it starts knows they need to find shelter fast, because the cold will kill you before morning. That's the context, you see. That's the landscape that made this story possible. A lonely road across desolate moorland, an inn that couldn't turn travellers away, because to refuse shelter in that weather was tantamount to murder, and men who understood that desperation makes people careless, makes them open doors they might otherwise have kept bolted. The Helm Wind creates another problem too. It masks sound. When it's roaring across the fells, you can't hear footsteps in the yard, can't hear a latch being lifted or a window being forced. You're trapped inside your own walls by the noise, deaf to everything except the shriek of the storm. Perfect conditions for a gang of thieves who needed time to work without raising the alarm. I'll tell you the story properly in a moment, but first you need to understand what this thing was. Not the folklore version, not the sanitized tale, the actual object and what went into making it. Because someone did make them. We know this. We have one. The recipe comes from a book called the Petit Albert. Published in France in 1722, though the knowledge it contains is older, much older. It's one of those grimoires that circulated among people who worked in the margins, folk healers, cunning men, and the sort of individual who'd know how to procure a corpse without asking too many questions. The instructions don't waste words. First, you need a felon. Specifically, a hanged man still swinging in his chains on a gibbet. It has to be the hand that committed the crime, usually the right hand, though some versions specify whichever hand did the deed. You cut it off at the wrist while the body's still on public display. Then comes the preservation. You can't just dry it or it'll rot. You need an earthenware jar and a pickling mixture, salt, saltpeter, long peppers, and something called zimat. Scholars argue about what zimat actually was, possibly copper acetate, possibly verdigris. Whatever it was, it hardened the flesh and turned it the color of old leather. The hand goes into the jar for a fortnight. Then you take it out and dry it. The preferred method is exposure to sun during the dog days of August, the hottest stretch of summer. If the weather doesn't cooperate, you can use an oven, but the fuel has to be specific. Fern and vervain. Vervain was sacred to the old religions, used for breaking enchantments. The irony of using it to create one apparently didn't trouble anyone. What emerges is something that looks more like a tree root than a part of a human body. Dark, desiccated, fingers either curled into a fist or stretched out straight depending on how it was cured. The veins stand out like cords. The fingernails remain intact, which is somehow worse than if they'd fallen away. But the hand itself is only the holder. The real work is in what you put on it. Some versions used a candle made from the fat of the hanged man himself, rendered down and mixed with virgin beeswax and sesame seed. The wick was his own hair. Other versions had you anoint the fingers directly with this mixture and set them alight, turning each digit into a taper. 5 flames burning from 5 dead fingers. Why go to such lengths? Why handle such corruption? Because of what it supposedly did. The belief was absolute. Light the hand of glory in a house where people slept, and they would remain asleep. Not just ordinary sleep, but a charmed stupor so profound that you could shout in their faces, shake them, even fire a pistol by their ears, and they wouldn't stir. You could strip the house of everything valuable, load it onto a cart in the yard, and drive away while the residents lay paralyzed in their beds. There's a pharmacological theory about this actually. The plants associated with the hand, mandrake, henbane, nightshade, all contain tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, atropine. Burn those in a confined space and the smoke could genuinely induce a heavy narcotic stupor. It wouldn't be magic making the victim sleep. It would be chemistry. The charm sleep might simply have been poisoning by degrees, but the men who used it didn't think in terms of chemistry. They thought in terms of power. Dead man's power specifically. The hand had committed crimes in life, in death it would commit them again. The fat had been rendered by violence. Burning it would release that violence back into the world. It was sympathetic magic of the darkest sort, and it was used. We know this because of what happened at the Spital Inn. October 1797. The Helm Wind had been blowing for 2 days straight, battering the inn on Stainmore until the shutters rattled and the chimney howled. George Alderson, the landlord, was a practical man. He knew the road, knew the weather, knew what happened to people caught out in a storm like that. So when the knock came just as he was bolting the door for the night, he opened it. An old woman stood on the threshold, bent nearly double, wrapped in rags, shivering violently. She asked for shelter. Not a bed. She couldn't afford a bed. Just a corner by the kitchen fire where she could rest until morning. George let her in. What else could he do? The household settled for the night. George and his wife upstairs, the stable boy in his loft, the other guests in their chambers. Only Bella, the serving girl, remained in the kitchen. She'd been tasked with banking the fire and making sure the old woman had what she needed. But Bella was sharp. She'd noticed something while the stranger was warming herself at the hearth. When the figure stretched out her legs toward the heat, the ragged skirt rode up slightly. Underneath, Bella glimpsed heavy leather gaiters, riding boots, the kind a man would wear. She said nothing, just settled herself on the wooden settle, pulled a blanket over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep. She watched through her lashes, breathing slowly and steadily while the fire burned low. When the house had been silent for perhaps an hour, the figure by the hearth moved. The stoop vanished. The trembling ceased. The old woman straightened up, rolled her shoulders, and became a man. Young, lean, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this before. He reached into his cloak and drew out something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Bella's breath caught in her throat. It was a hand. A withered, grey thing, fingers outstretched, the skin like old parchment stretched over bone. He set it upright on the kitchen table as carefully as if it were made of glass. Then he produced a tinderbox, struck a light, and touched a flame to the fingertips. They caught immediately, burned with a flame that was wrong somehow. Too blue, too cold, giving off almost no light despite the fire. The smell was worse. Not wax or tallow, but something organic and rancid, like meat left too long in the sun. The man began to speak. Not loud, just a low chant barely audible over the wind outside. Let those who rest more deeply sleep. Let those awake their vigils keep. O hand of glory, shed thy light. Direct us to our spoil tonight. Then he walked to the door, opened it a crack, and whistled. 3 short bursts, signaling to whoever was waiting outside in the storm. Bella knew she had seconds at most. She rose from the settle as quietly as she could and ran for the stairs. Shook her master's shoulder. "Sir, wake up. There's thieves in the house." George Alderson didn't move. His eyes stayed closed, his breathing deep and slow, as if he'd been drugged. She shook him harder. Nothing. It was like trying to wake a corpse. Downstairs, she could hear boots in the yard. Multiple sets. The gang was coming in. Bella ran back down the stairs. The thief had moved to the doorway, holding it open for his companions. She could see shapes moving in the yard, dark figures carrying sacks and pry bars. They'd be inside in moments. She grabbed a cup from the table and filled it from the water pitcher, threw it on the burning hand. The flame hissed and spat but didn't go out. If anything, it burned brighter, the blue light pulsing like something alive. She tried the dregs from the ale jug. Same result. The fire seemed to feed on liquid, drawing strength from it rather than dying. The men were in the passageway now. She could hear their voices, low and urgent, discussing which rooms to start with. Then something her grandmother had told her surfaced in her mind. Something about witches' fires and how to quench them. It had to be pure. It had to be innocent. Water wouldn't work because water could be corrupted. Ale wouldn't work because ale was the product of fermentation, of rot. But milk, fresh milk from the dairy, that might. She found the jug on the cold shelf, still half full from that evening supper, grabbed it with both hands and dashed the contents over the hand in one smooth motion. The effect was immediate. The blue flames guttered and died with a sound like a gasp. Smoke, thick, greasy, foul-smelling, poured from the thing and then dissipated. The hand itself seemed to shrink slightly, as if whatever had animated it had fled. Upstairs, George Alderson jerked awake with the violence of a man surfacing from deep water. For a moment, he didn't know where he was, what had woken him. Then he heard the voices downstairs, heard the creak of floorboards under unfamiliar weight. He didn't hesitate, grabbed the blunderbuss he kept loaded by the bed and went to the window, threw open the shutters and aimed into the yard, where he could see figures loading his property onto a cart. The shot lit up the night. One of the men screamed. The others scattered immediately, abandoning the cart, the stolen goods, everything. They knew the spell had broken, knew that stealth was impossible now, and that every moment they remained was a moment closer to the rope. The man inside, the one who'd posed as an old woman, tried to bolt through the kitchen, but Bella had barred the back door while the hand was burning. He turned, saw her standing between him and his only escape, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then he went for the window instead, smashing through the shutters and into the night. By the time George made it downstairs with the blunderbuss reloaded, the yard was empty except for the cart and its half-filled cargo. And the hand, still sitting on the kitchen table, smoking faintly, the fingers now blackened and curled. George Alderson kept it, had it mounted in a wooden case with a brass plaque explaining what it was and how close his household had come to being robbed, or worse, while they slept. He showed it to travellers as a warning. The story spread up and down the coaching routes, told and retold until every servant girl in the north knew to keep milk handy, and every landlord thought twice about who they admitted on stormy nights. The aftermath rippled outward in other ways too. One of the thieves was found the next morning, bleeding from buckshot wounds, trying to reach the surgery in Brew. He was arrested, tried, and hanged. Before he died, he confirmed the story. Said the hand had been purchased from a cunning woman in Penrith, who claimed to have the recipe from her grandmother. Said it had worked perfectly on 3 previous jobs: houses in Appleby, Kirkby Stephen, and Kendal, before the Spital Inn. The authorities searched for the others but never found them. Likely they fled south, or changed their trade, or ended up on a gibbet themselves for some other crime. The roads were full of desperate men in those days, still are in their way. But here's the thing that'll keep you awake tonight, if you let it. The hand itself survived, not the one from the Spital Inn, that was destroyed, burned in the inn's own hearth, and the ashes scattered. But another one, a real one. In 1935, a stonemason named Joseph Ford was working on a derelict cottage in Castleton, up on the North York moors. He was dismantling the wall head, the space between the top of the wall and the roof, when his crowbar struck something that wasn't stone. He pulled out a package wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was a mummified human hand, severed cleanly at the wrist, the fingers outstretched, the skin dark as old leather. It's in the Whitby Museum now. You can go and see it if you've the stomach for it. It sits in a glass case with a little card explaining what it is. If you look closely, you can see the veins still visible beneath the skin. Can see where the fingertips are scorched, as if they'd been lit and allowed to burn partway down before being extinguished. Someone made that. Someone cut it from a corpse, pickled it in salt and chemicals, dried it in the sun or an oven, and hid it in their wall. Whether they used it, whether it worked, we'll never know. But they believed it would. Believed it enough to go through the appalling labor of creating it. And that's the question that stays with me when I'm sitting here of an evening and the wind's getting up outside. How many others are still hidden? How many cottages and coaching inns and old houses have them tucked away in their walls or buried under their hearthstones, waiting to be found by some unsuspecting builder or archaeologist? The fire's burning low now. Look at that. Just embers, glowing like eyes in the dark. The wind's dropped though. You'll have a clear walk home, which is more than those thieves had. Before you go, let me top up your glass one last time. Here's to Bella, the quick-thinking servant girl who saved her household with nothing but her wits and a jug of milk. Here's to George Alderson, who didn't hesitate when it mattered. And here's to the doors we lock and the trust we extend when someone knocks asking for shelter. Because that's the real horror of the Hand of Glory, isn't it? Not the thing itself, but what it represents. The violation of hospitality, the exploitation of mercy, the knowledge that the person you let in from the cold might not be what they seem, and that the candle they light might not be there to give warmth. These days, we've got electric lights and deadbolts and alarm systems. We think we're safer than our ancestors. Maybe we are, but the principle remains the same. Every time you open your door to a stranger, you're taking a small leap of faith, trusting that they're what they claim to be, that their need is genuine. Most of the time, that trust is warranted. Most of the time. But on nights like this, when the wind sounds almost like voices and the shadows stretch long across old floors, it doesn't hurt to remember that milk's not just for tea. Keep a jug in the larder, just in case. Now off with you. Mind how you go. And if you're ever passing through Whitby, if you find yourself in that museum looking at that withered hand in its case, remember, it's not there because it didn't work. It's there because someone thought it would. You've been listening to British Pub Lore. Mind how you go.